Action Ragnar of Camellia Palace, and Remington himself. These were the strongest warriors of the Ragnar clan's awakening ceremony generation. Remington introduced himself and explained that he had come early to see Theo's swordsmanship before the awakening ceremony. Curious, Theo activated his observation skill and saw that Remington was 17 years old, held the title of Deputy Clan Head of Narcio, and was also known as the Silver Lion, one of the 4 Hounds of the North. His talents were listed as Sword Genius, Keen Senses, and Extremely Hard Worker. His current status revealed that he was surprised to see a rival he hadn't expected. Raising his sword, Remington thanked Theo for fulfilling his wish, expressing his desire to test his skills. Theo raised his own sword and introduced himself as the 31st son of the Great Guardian of the North, Kyle Ragnar, and an apprentice swordsman preparing for the awakening ceremony. Smiling, Theo felt honored. He never imagined he would meet and fight the legendary sword genius Remington, someone he had admired for a long time. While his quest was still ongoing, the thrill of fighting Remington was all that mattered to him at that moment. Theo humbly told Remington that it was an honor to cross swords with the famed Deputy Clan Head of Narcio. Remington, in turn, expressed his excitement for the upcoming battle. As they both took their stances, Theo wondered if his current abilities were enough to defeat someone as formidable as Remington, one of the 4 Hounds of the North. Their swords clashed, sending a loud metallic sound reverberating through the area. As their battle began, the system showed that Theo's tutorial quest progress had increased by 1%. Due to the strong clash of their swords, one of them shattered into pieces, completely destroyed. Evelyn observed calmly, but the knights were stunned. Half of the broken sword fell to the ground. It was Theo's. The spectators couldn't believe that their young master had seemingly lost. Sybil, in disbelief, shouted that it couldn't be true, but Manuel pointed out that it was an obvious result. No matter how much Theo had grown, it was impossible for him to defeat one of the 4 Hounds, the strongest warriors of their generation. Still, Sybil praised Theo's fighting spirit. The knights were even more surprised when Remington admitted that it was his loss. He thanked Theo for the good duel, explaining that his sword had already been worn out and he was exhausted, which meant the duel was his defeat. However, Theo responded that, on a battlefield, no one would offer such considerations, and admitted that he had lost the moment he lost his sword. Remington smiled at Theo and they shook hands. Remington expressed his hope for a proper duel next time, and Theo agreed, hoping for the same. Manuel was shocked to see that Theo had been acknowledged by one of the 4 Hounds, while Sybil proudly shouted to Manuel that their young master, Theo, was different. Evelyn sighed in relief, and the system informed Theo that his quest progress had increased to 35%. Theo looked at Remington, acknowledging his strength. He understood that while he had gained incredible power from talents and secret manuals through the system, Remington's skill was still far beyond his. The moment their swords clashed, Theo realized that he still had much to improve. Though disappointed that the duel ended prematurely, Theo felt he had gained a lot. Not only had his luck increased by 10 points, but his reputation had also improved significantly. However, he was still dissatisfied with his quest progress, which hadn't moved as much as he'd hoped. He began thinking about what stage or event might help him gain more approval. Remington then called out to him, explaining that he hadn't come just to duel. Handing Theo an envelope, Remington invited him to join the Scaled Dragon Society. Sybil was shocked, knowing that the Scaled Dragon Society was a prestigious group, exclusive to those who had been specially selected. He couldn't believe that Remington had personally invited Theo. Theo, equally surprised, questioned whether someone like him was suited to join such a famous group. Remington dismissed Theo's doubts, saying that he was more than qualified. He explained that the Scaled Dragon Society wasn't as serious as it sounded. It was simply a social group for peers preparing for the upcoming awakening ceremony. Curious, Sybil asked why Theo was being invited, while Bennett, overwhelmed, looked ready to cry. Theo wasn't sure of Remington's motives for the invitation, but he knew that the Scaled Dragon Society was centered around action and filled with people who looked down on him. He realized this would be the perfect environment to progress his quest and gather information on action and Camellia Palace. There was no reason to refuse. Accepting the invitation, Theo thanked Remington and confirmed that he would participate. The knights were amazed that Theo had been invited to the Scaled Dragon Society, and the system informed him that his quest progress had increased by 1%. Remington shook Theo's hand, pleased with his decision, and told him that if he had any questions, he shouldn't hesitate to ask. Remington then mentioned that the next meeting would be in 2 weeks. Evelyn, lighting her cigar, watched them silently, deep in thought. A moment later, at Rose Palace, Cecilia barged into Theo's room, calling out to him. Surprised, he told her he was just about to deliver some news, but he was left speechless when several maids followed her inside. Stammering, he asked his mother what was going on. Cecilia excitedly explained that she had heard about his invitation to the Scaled Dragon Society. She went on to explain that the society included action, the son of the cunning Amel, as well as brilliant talents like Remington. The maids began assessing which colors suited him best, while Cecilia explained that the Scaled Dragon Society garnered attention from the council. Everything about him, from how he dressed to how he composed himself, would be scrutinized. As Cecilia measured his shoulders, she reassured him that while his etiquette would be flawless, his attire and demeanor were matters she could help with. She reminded him that she used to be an actress, so this was something she knew well, and she was more than happy to assist him. Theo knew he was often labeled the illegitimate child of a commoner concubine, and his mother had always felt guilty about it, even though it wasn't her fault. In the cold Ragnar clan, he could only imagine how hard it must have been for her, especially with a son who was often seen as lacking. Cecilia then hugged him tightly, calling him her son, and told him she believed in him, that she knew he could succeed. Theo smiled, touched by her words, and hugged her back, assuring her that there was no need to worry anymore. The room was filled with emotion, and everyone present was moved by the moment. Cecilia, with pride, declared that her son was joining the Scaled Dragon Society. 2 weeks later, on the night of the Scaled Dragon Society banquet, Remington stood outside Rose Palace, waiting. He was taken aback when Theo walked out, dressed impeccably, with Cecilia and the servants wishing him good luck. Theo smiled at Remington, but Remington, still in awe, asked if it was really him, commenting on how different he looked. Theo laughed, telling Remington to stop teasing, but Remington insisted he was being genuine and pointed toward the carriage. As they got into the carriage, Theo reflected on Remington's words. He did feel different. He had grown taller, his muscles had become more defined, and 2 weeks of diligent training had clearly paid off. During that time, Remington had visited him daily, and they had grown closer. Not to mention, Theo had also gained new followers. Evelyn had sighed many times during the 2 weeks, saying she only intended to teach him for a short while but somehow got pulled into a more involved process. Theo, in turn, simply looked away, knowing how exhausting the past weeks had been, especially with Remington's daily presence, which made Evelyn hit her head in frustration more than once. As the carriage rattled along, Remington asked if this would be Theo's first formal banquet, to which Theo replied it was. Remington reassured him, saying there was no need to be nervous, he knew Theo would do well. However, he also warned Theo about his friend, Action, which left Theo confused. Remington explained that Action could be very mischievous, but in fact, it was Action who had extended the invitation, not Remington. Action had expressed a desire to meet Theo and had gone so far as to prepare the banquet in his honor. Remington hoped Theo wouldn't think too harshly of Action. Theo, now understanding that it was Action who had invited him, smiled, thinking it was all going a bit too well. He replied that he was looking forward to it, fully expecting the evening to come with its share of insults and challenges. Meanwhile, at Camellia Palace, Action held a glass of alcohol, excitedly anticipating the arrival of what he saw as a new toy, Theo, the imbecile of Ragnar. A moment later, the carriage stopped, and the driver informed them that they had arrived. Remington stepped down first, followed by Theo, who looked up to see they had reached Camellia Palace, the place that had once instigated Rendon to interfere with his growth and ultimately consumed his mother and the entirety of Rose Palace. Remington asked if they should head inside, and Theo responded affirmatively. As they walked, Remington mentioned that Action would personally greet him at the entrance, a rare gesture. However, Theo's mind was elsewhere. He knew Action was likely trying to halt his rise, but Theo had come prepared, determined to make Action realize who he was really dealing with. Suddenly, a blue light reflected off his earrings. When he looked up, Theo noticed the glow of the quest in one of the rooms, making him wonder if there was a quest hidden within Camellia Palace. Before he could investigate further, Remington called out his name in alarm, rushing toward him as something fell from above. A loud explosion followed, leaving a cloud of dust. Shocked, Remington called out again, but Theo emerged from the dust, replying that he was fine. It had only been a sack of flour. Remington, furious, looked up and demanded to know what the culprits were doing. Theo brushed the flour off his clothes, knowing that in his past life, he wouldn't have been able to dodge and would have been covered in the powder. He glanced at Remington, suspecting for a moment that he might have been in on the prank. But after checking Remington's status using observation, Theo saw genuine confusion and realized Remington had no part in it. Looking up, Theo knew the flower stunt had been Action's doing. Sure enough, Action appeared and asked what Theo thought of his greeting, claiming it was simply a friendly welcome, basic courtesy between peers. Remington angrily demanded an explanation, but Action brushed it off, asking if Remington was actually upset and suggesting he should just take it as a playful greeting between brothers. Theo activated his observation skill on Action and saw that Action held the title Dark Tiger and was an apprentice swordsman. His talents included madness, psychopath, and overwhelming swordsmanship talent, and his current status showed he was excited, viewing Theo as a new toy to play with. Smiling, Theo thanked Action, which surprised him. When Action asked what he meant by that, Theo brightly explained that Action's warm welcome naturally made him feel grateful, and he was looking forward to the party. Action, taken aback at first, quickly recovered and commented that it had been a while since he had so much fun. A moment later, they entered the grand party room, where murmurs and whispers filled the air. The guests were confused about Action's intentions. Many questioned why someone from the direct line, like Action, would invite Theo, the so-called imbecile, to the prestigious Scaled Dragon Society. Yet, as they observed Theo, they admitted he seemed more composed than expected. Theo walked through the room with Remington, sipping wine, while the other guests continued whispering, wondering if Action was planning to toy with Theo again. Remington, feeling embarrassed, apologized to Theo once more, explaining that they usually weren't this hostile. Theo reassured him, saying he was fine and, in fact, was even grateful for the attention, leaving Remington confused. Theo internally smiled, thinking that all the gossip and insults were necessary. He needed them to talk behind his back, because the more they did, the sweeter his victory would be when he crushed them later. As Theo continued scanning the room, he noticed that the source of the blue light, the quest marker he had seen from outside, was located on the second floor. He was certain it was linked to a quest, but for now, he had no natural way to approach it without drawing attention. Theo sipped his wine, deep in thought, but was soon interrupted by Action, who came down asking if he was enjoying the party. Theo reminded himself to stay calm and follow through with his plan. Smiling, he responded that he was indeed enjoying it and thanked Action for the invitation. Action, feigning apology, admitted that he might have gone overboard earlier. Placing a hand on Theo's shoulder, Action creepily asked if Theo would accept his apology. Before Theo could respond, Remington angrily called out to Action. But instead of addressing Remington's anger, Theo surprised everyone by saying there was no need for an apology. He only remembered a friendly greeting. Action, taken aback for a moment, laughed and slapped Theo on the back, declaring how fun Theo had become and that he had no idea Theo was like this. Action added, loud enough for the guests to hear, that Theo had changed a lot from how he used to be, and he liked him more and more. The guests laughed, teasing that Theo was just smiling and acting like Action's lapdog. One man commented that an illegitimate child like Theo, with no real roots, could never stand up to the noble blood of the Troyvan family. Another guest agreed, saying that despite both being Ragnars, Theo and Action were on completely different levels. How could someone like Theo, born of a random woman, ever compare to the noble swordsmanship lineage of the Troyvan clan? Despite hearing all the whispers, Theo remained calm, smiling outwardly while holding back his anger. The guests then shifted their gossip to Remington, wondering why he was so close to Theo. One of them remarked that if they looked into it, Remington was also illegitimate. This shocked Remington and left the room in an uncomfortable silence. The man who had spoken suddenly realized he had crossed a line, as Remington's illegitimacy was a forbidden topic. Theo, sensing the sadness from Remington and growing more furious, decided to act. Calling out to Action, Theo asked if he should introduce himself to his new friends. He walked over to the table, grabbed a bottle of wine, and approached the man who had insulted Remington. The man, sensing something was off, stuttered, asking if he had said something wrong. Without warning, Theo swung the bottle and smashed it over the man's head, stunning both Action and Remington. The man screamed in pain, clutching his bleeding head, calling Theo a bastard. But Theo responded with a swift kick to the man's head, knocking him to the ground. Calmly, Theo asked what the man meant by bastard and remarked that he had merely given him a friendly greeting. Using bastard was such a hurtful thing to say. The other guests panicked, whispering in disbelief and questioning whether Theo was truly the imbecile they had assumed. As this unfolded, Theo's tutorial quest progress jumped to 43%. Remington, shocked, realized this wasn't the Theo he knew and wondered if Theo was acting for his sake. Meanwhile, Theo stood over the fallen man and, with a cold smile, stated that he had extended his welcome. Stepping on the man's arm, he asked if it was time for the man to say his goodbyes, gripping his arm tightly. The man pleaded for Theo to wait, but with a swift motion, Theo snapped the man's arm, the bone breaking audibly. Everyone in the room stood frozen in shock and disbelief as Theo's quest progress surged to 59%. As the man collapsed in agony, Theo released his grip and casually asked if anyone else wanted to say hello. His quest progress increased again, now reaching 66%. At that moment, guards emerged from hiding, surrounding Theo and drawing their swords, aiming them at his head. They shouted that harming their young master would be paid for with death. Theo wasn't surprised. He knew the man he had just beaten was Ian Hanabi, the third young master of the Hanabi clan, one of the 6 snow clans that supported Ragnar. But this was exactly why he had come to the Scaled Dragon Society, knowing it was filled with enemies. Theo addressed the guards calmly, telling them that he knew the Hanabi clan's position, and he expected that they wouldn't stand idly by while the imbecile they had always looked down on suddenly started fighting back. But he no longer planned to tolerate their disrespect. Theo then asked the guards, so what if Ian is the young master of the Hanabi clan? His words left the knights stunned. He followed up with a sharp question, asking if the dogs of a Ragnar Bannerman clan dared to demand his death and if they were prepared to take responsibility for such words. The knights stood frozen in fear, wondering what kind of pressure they were feeling and if this could really be the imbecile of Ragnar they thought they knew. One of the knights suddenly realized the gravity of the situation. Theo, as a direct descendant of Ragnar, held the right of succession. Ragnar was the Lord of the North, ruling over the 6 snow clans. Declaring death upon a bloodline of the Dragon Lord was a sin so severe that the destruction of an entire clan wouldn't even be considered unreasonable. The knight understood that while this hadn't applied to Theo for a long time, it did now, and they would need to apologize immediately. But before they could act, Theo gave an order to kill them. A sword flashed through the air, swiftly decapitating the knights who had aimed their blades at Theo. He stood calmly, staring as the bodies collapsed to the ground. The guests, Remington, and even Action were shocked by the sudden violence, while Theo's quest progress jumped to 70%. At that moment, Evelyn appeared, asking Theo when he realized she had been following him. He replied simply that it was obvious. Though he hadn't known why she was following, Theo felt relief, knowing she was there allowed him to turn the tables without hesitation. As they exchanged glances, the room fell into a tense silence. The night before, in a quiet room, Julius poured himself a glass of wine and reminded Evelyn that she had once said she wouldn't take on any more disciples. He asked if her new swordsmanship disciple, Theo, was to her liking. Evelyn, not indulging in small talk, asked if Julius didn't have someplace else to be, reminding him that he only ever stayed close before her retirement. Laughing, Julius admitted that tormenting her had become his latest joy, and again pressed her for an answer about Theo. Evelyn sighed, pointing out that the wine Julius was drinking was expensive. Julius drank it anyway and pressed her once more for an answer. Finally, Evelyn admitted that Theo had far exceeded her expectations. Considering both his attitude and talent, she stated that he was the best student she had ever taught. Julius, curious, reminded her that Action had once passed through her hands as well and asked if she still considered Theo to be better. Evelyn confirmed this, explaining that Theo's potential was far beyond even Action's. She assured Julius that these were not empty words. Julius chuckled, noting that Evelyn's sharp eyes gave her an advantage in seeing such things. He then asked if Theo had been hiding his strength all this time, since it was impossible for someone to change so drastically overnight. Evelyn agreed, saying it seemed Theo had been concealing his abilities, but she found it strange that someone who had kept their strength hidden for so long would suddenly start flaunting it. She added that being too hasty often led to mistakes, and it felt as though Theo was being chased by something. That, she said, was why she was concerned about his attendance at the Scaled Dragon Society. Julius, seeing her worry, suggested it was likely because of Action and advised her to follow Theo if she was so concerned. Confused, Evelyn asked what he meant. Julius explained that when wolf cubs searching for blood gather, they tend to solidify their hierarchy. Something was bound to happen. He then added, with a sly grin, that while she was there, she might as well tempt Theo into joining the white-armored dragon cavalry. Julius placed a cavalry uniform on her table, leaving her momentarily stunned. As he walked toward the door, he suggested that both she and Theo join the cavalry together. Smiling, Julius teased her, saying she couldn't retire just because he couldn't ride a dragon, and that she should take responsibility for the one she had introduced. Waving goodbye, Julius commented that the wine had been excellent, leaving Evelyn speechless. She glanced at the uniform and quietly remarked that, of course, it tasted good, it was expensive. Back at Camellia Palace, Evelyn watched Theo and realized he had orchestrated the entire situation on purpose, having known she was following him all along. It dawned on her that perhaps Theo had joined the Scaled Dragon Society with this exact plan in mind. He wasn't someone she needed to worry about after all. She wondered when exactly he had noticed her presence, confirming to herself that he was far from ordinary. Theo, in fact, had sensed Evelyn's presence the moment he entered the carriage. His dragon heart allowed him to unleash his energy perception, often referred to as a sixth sense. He was thankful for it, knowing the stage had been set and that the final step of his plan was about to unfold. He turned to Evelyn and called out to her, stating that most of the people present had shown disrespect to a successor candidate. Calmly, he asked her what the punishment was for such a crime. His question shocked and horrified the guests. Evelyn replied that, according to clan law, immediate execution was possible. Smiling at her answer, Theo said that since the offenders were all children who hadn't even undergone their awakening ceremony, she should take only one of their arms and leave it at that. Without hesitation, Evelyn dashes at the guests, replying that she understood. Panic spread among the nobles as they stutteringly begged her to wait, but it was too late. She swiftly cut off the arm of the first noble in her path, announcing that she was done with the second son of the Byron clan. One by one, she moved through the room, cutting off the arms of the first son of the Red and White Mercenary Corps, the fourth daughter of the Ceres Merchant Guild, the third son of the Clark clan, and the first daughter of the Howard clan. With each strike, Theo's tutorial quest progress increased, first to 72%, then to 76%, and finally to 79%. One of the nobles grabbed Action's pants, begging him to intervene. But Action merely stared down at him, asking why he should help when it was just a greeting. The man stuttered in disbelief, trying to process Action's response, but before he could react further, Evelyn slashed his arm, leaving him writhing on the floor in pain. Evelyn announced that she had dealt with the first son of the Parank family. Action and Evelyn locked eyes, and Action remarked that he hadn't expected to meet her again under these circumstances. Evelyn respectfully raised her sword to her head and acknowledged it had been a while. Theo's quest progress jumped to 82%. Action realized that Evelyn had only targeted those who had insulted Theo's bloodline, leaving him unable to interfere even as a fellow successor candidate. He watched as Evelyn approached Theo, reporting that she had cut the right arms of the 14 individuals he had ordered her to. Remington also approached, and Theo praised Evelyn for her work and asking about the status of the wounded. Evelyn calmly replied that if they took the severed arms to a priest quickly, they could be reattached, but their futures as swordsmen were in doubt. Theo responded that it was perfect. Remington, concerned, asked Theo if he was alright. Action, observing the situation, realized both Remington and Evelyn had become captivated by Theo. Laughing to himself, Action confirmed that the imbecile of Rose Palace had truly changed. However, he couldn't suppress the growing rage inside him, wanting nothing more than to crush Theo beneath his feet. As Theo turned to leave, he calmly told Evelyn and Remington that it was time to go. Evelyn immediately agreed, and Remington, stuttering, said he would follow as well. When Theo passed Action, he lightly tapped him on the arm and smiled, remarking that he had enjoyed the evening. This Action completed his fourth tutorial quest. As he walked away, he told Action that they would see each other again soon, leaving Action fuming with anger. The system congratulated Theo for completing his final tutorial quest in the presence of Evelyn Nareville. Action, furious, called out Theo's name loudly, but the system showed that all tutorial quests had been completed. No one would call him the imbecile of Ragnar anymore. Proudly, Theo walked out of Camellia Palace, knowing that while the quest was complete, his true revenge had only just begun. As a reward, he received an experience elixir, a potion capable of leveling him up 5 times, though it could only be used below level 30. Later, back at Camellia Palace, Amel was in her office, working on paperwork, when a man reported the events of the evening to her. In shock, she ordered him to repeat the information. As the man confirmed the chaos at Action's Scaled Dragon Society, Amel and Ed were left speechless. Meanwhile, at the Rose Palace Inn, Sybil lifted his glass of alcohol high, shouting that they were celebrating their young master Theo's unbelievable high society debut. The others cheered, clinking their glasses together in excitement as they partied around Theo, making him feel a sense of relief. He drank his beer in victory, surrounded by people he could finally call his own. That same night at Camellia Palace, a loud slap echoed from one of the rooms, reverberating down the hallway. Inside, Amel furiously confronted Action, scolding him for giving Theo, the imbecile bastard, justification to act and for allowing his people's arms to be chopped off. Action simply replied, yes, which only fueled Amel's rage. She shouted, asking if he really believed any of it made sense and reminded him how many times she had warned him not to take Theo lightly. She then ordered Action to forget any plans of pressuring Theo into submission, pointing out that he had just given Theo the grounds to go wild. Amel stressed once more that she had warned him repeatedly, once Theo Ragnar began to stand out, it would become far more difficult to take control of Rose Palace. Action tried to reassure his mother that she needn't worry, but she cut him off, shouting that she didn't want to hear it. She ordered him to reflect on his actions, accusing him of almost ruining their grand plan just for the sake of shallow enjoyment. Action reluctantly replied that he would keep it in mind before leaving the room. As Action exited, Amel furiously asked, "Who does he take after to be so impulsive?" A voice from the shadows replied, "He takes after you when you were young." Startled, Amel asked if that was meant as a joke. Ed, her brother, stepped forward from the darkness and told her not to be so angry, suggesting that the incident might not be as bad as she thought. Curious, Amel asked why. Ed explained that since Rose Palace had always been part of the clan head's harem, it was difficult to seize ownership. While it had been largely ignored by the clan head as a place where riffraff gathered, it still had his backing. To take control, they needed justification. Ed went on to say that, fortunately, Theo had created significant chaos at the Scaled Dragon Society meeting, and as he slowly became the representative of Rose Palace, they could use the incident as justification. This surprised Amel. Amel had been unsettled by Theo's growing strength, fearing that it might attract more attention from the clan head, making their influence over Rose Palace harder to solidify. But Ed suggested they could now use Theo's rise to their advantage. By using legal procedures under the pretense of discipline, they could quietly suppress Theo and his growing influence, leaving Rose Palace with no choice but to submit to the Troivans, thus taking over without causing a stir. Amel, closing her fan with excitement, asked Ed how long it would take to prepare everything. Ed smiled and told her preparations were already complete. He assured her that by the time she woke up in the morning, she would hear uplifting news. With that, he encouraged her to enjoy a bath and get a good night's sleep. Handing her an aromatic candle, he added that he had gone to great lengths to acquire it from the volcanic regions of South Arkan. Amel embraced Ed, telling him that she expected nothing less from her elder brother and that it was why she couldn't help but love him. Meanwhile, back at the Rose Palace Inn, Remington approached Theo, clearly shocked. He confessed that he hadn't realized Theo cared so much. Confused, Theo asked what he meant. Remington explained that he was referring to what had happened at the Scaled Dragon Society, but Theo just wondered if Remington was drunk despite only drinking orange juice. Remington continued, saying that while Theo had endured the insults aimed at himself, the moment people began insulting Remington, Theo didn't hesitate to step in and defend him. Remington admitted that he had been unable to act and felt embarrassed for not doing anything himself. Looking at Theo, Remington found himself increasingly surprised by the person Theo had become. He reflected on how Theo had endured being looked down upon for so long, seen by many as an untalented, illegitimate child. Yet despite all that, Theo had emerged stronger. Remington also remembered that Theo had faced opponents even when the odds were against him, wielding his sword without hesitation and standing firm in battles where his strength alone wasn't enough. In those moments, Remington realized Theo possessed both the willpower and courage to fight for others, not just himself. Remington's status showed that he was deeply touched, believing that Theo genuinely cared for him. Theo, however, quickly realized that Remington had greatly misunderstood something. Remington recalled his clan's orders to build friendly ties with action, but his heart was set on something else. Suddenly, Remington stood up and, with a determined voice, declared that he wished to follow Theo from now on. The room erupted in cheers, with everyone shouting that, as expected, the strong recognized the strong. Theo, caught off guard, tried to explain the misunderstanding, calling out to Remington to wait. He started to say that Remington had misunderstood something, but before he could finish, he heard Evelyn's voice in his head, telling him to just let Remington be. Stunned, Theo wondered if it was telepathy. He turned around to see Evelyn smiling at him. Using telepathy, she explained that it wasn't a bad misunderstanding and that, perhaps, everyone just wanted to get along with him. Surprised, Theo sighed, thinking that he wasn't anyone special. He mused that all of this, the regression, the power of Ragnar's talent, and his newfound strength might be due to the mysterious message window. Theo then pondered the nature of the system. Initially, he thought it was merely fragments of his regret, but its detail made him reconsider. He felt a vague sense of déjà vu, but whatever it was helping him, and so he concluded it didn't matter. He also noticed that, since the Scaled Dragon Society incident, his level had increased. He realized that leveling up granted him points to distribute across his stats, allowing him to increase his abilities as he wished. It felt both exhilarating and frightening, making him smile in a way that Evelyn found unsettling, confused by his expression. Realizing the need to prepare for the inevitable counterattack from Camellia Palace, Theo decided to act. He called Remington Remy and asked if he would help with something since he had already mentioned it. Remington, thrilled by the friendly nickname, immediately agreed, telling Theo to ask him anything. Excited, Remington noted how Theo had called him Remy in such a friendly manner. Theo lifted a piece of paper and told him that the war for the throne between him and Action would intensify soon, and they needed to prepare. He asked Remington to assist him, which left Remington momentarily shocked. Theo knew that in the future, Remington would become the clan head of the Narcio clan, a force powerful enough to confront the Ragnars. This was an opportunity to completely bring Remington to his side. Handing the paper to Remington, Theo hoped he would accept. Fortunately, Remington took the paper and, with conviction, pledged to follow Theo. He promised to help with whatever Theo needed. Theo smiled, thanked him, and acknowledged his loyalty. Just as Remington was about to remind Theo again of the friendly nickname, a voice shouted from outside. The inn door burst open, and a higher-ranking knight, one of the Swords of Law, walked in, shocking everyone. The knight, stern-faced, held up a warrant and declared that Theo was under arrest for threats, assault, and intimidation, leaving the room in stunned silence. Evelyn, outraged, shouted in disbelief, asking what kind of nonsense this was. Theo, remaining calm, stood up, reassuring everyone that it was all right and urged them to stay calm. He looked at the warrant from the knight, confirming its legitimacy, but noted that the ink hadn't even dried yet. It was clear they were in a rush. Voluntarily, Theo extended his hands and told the knights they should proceed. The captain of the Swords of Law placed handcuffs on Theo, and he followed them out of the inn. As Theo was led away, everyone in the inn called out to him in worry, but he looked back with a calm smile, which shocked both Remington and Evelyn. As he disappeared from view, Remington glanced down at the piece of paper Theo had left behind, his mind racing with uncertainty. The next day, at Rose Palace, Cecilia was in shock upon hearing the news. She shouted at the butler, asking if it was true that Theo had been taken to the tribunal. Overcome, she fell to her knees, causing the butler to rush to her side in worry. Cecilia reassured him that she was all right and asked what charges Theo was facing. The butler replied that it seemed to be related to the Scaled Dragon Society, and the accusation was inciting rebellion. Cecilia, even more shocked, struggled to comprehend the severity of the situation. The butler asked if she believed the case would go to trial. Cecilia, after a moment of thought, said she was sure it would. The butler added that since Theo had completely dismantled the Scaled Dragon Society, it wouldn't end easily. Cecilia, filled with concern, wondered who could have predicted that Theo's invitation to the Scaled Dragon Society would lead to such consequences. But then she stopped, reassuring herself that Theo would get through this. He was always that kind of child. She wished desperately for her son's safe return. Meanwhile, in the silence of the carriage, Theo was deep in thought, escorted by the Swords of Law. He opened his eyes and gazed out the window, seeing that they had arrived at the gate of the tribunal. It had been a long time since he had been there. He understood that after destroying the Scaled Dragon Society, this wouldn't end with simple imprisonment. A trial was inevitable. He also knew that being brought before the tribunal meant they intended to challenge his qualifications as Ragnar's successor. When they reached the tribunal door, the knight ordered Theo to get off. He quietly complied, thinking that they probably wanted to crush him completely this time, but that was exactly what he hoped for. With a faint smile, he followed the knights inside. Upon entering the grand courtroom, the head knight announced that Theo Ragnar had been escorted in. One of the officials inside ordered him to be brought forward. Theo, smiling, walked into the court, knowing that if he was going to reveal what he had prepared, it needed to be on a stage as grand as this one. As he surveyed the room, he confirmed that some powerful figures had gathered. Julius, the demon dragon and captain of the white-armored dragon cavalry, Ed Trovian, the sky dragon and director of the Central Intelligence Bureau, Osa Ragnar, the sword dragon and lady of Plum Blossom Palace, and Wolfgang Ragnar, the elder dragon and head counselor. In his past life, Theo would have been overwhelmed by the presence of these powerful figures, barely able to breathe. But now he was different. Wolfgang called his name, and Theo respectfully responded, acknowledging that it had been a while since they last met. He knew Wolfgang despised half-bloods like him. Illegitimate children were disgusting in Wolfgang's eyes. Theo noticed that Wolfgang didn't even bother hiding his contempt. Wolfgang cut to the chase, telling Theo that pleasantries were unnecessary, and reminding him that he had been summoned to answer for his crimes. He continued, saying that the Byron clan, the Ceres Merchant Guild, the Red and White Mercenary Corps, and even the Hanabi clan were now clamoring to cut ties with the main Ragnar family because of Theo's foolish actions. Wolfgang, filled with anger, shouted at Theo, asking if he, a mere bastard, could bear the damage he had caused. He accused Theo of dragging Ragnar's honor through the dirt and declared that he would be held accountable. Theo, facing the strong enemy calmly, agreed that Wolfgang's words were correct. He admitted he had been careless, which seemed to momentarily calm Wolfgang. But then, to the shock of everyone in the room, Theo added that his mistake was not cutting off their heads, but only their limbs. The room fell silent as Theo continued, explaining that those people were subjects, and the relationship between lord and subject was based on the bestowal of land and honor in exchange for loyalty and lives. That was the way of chivalry. He then raised his voice, accusing the nobles of daring to threaten their lord and asserting that if he had known they would be so insolent, he would have executed them immediately. He insisted they must be punished and that the principles of chivalry had to be restored. With intensity, he asked how he could sit by and watch as Ragnar's honor, upheld for over 1,000 years, was trampled. Wolfgang and Ed were left speechless, shocked by Theo's bold words. Julius, on the other hand, smiled to himself, impressed by Theo's resolve, thinking that Theo was as impressive as ever and confident that the situation would end with a normal punishment. Wolfgang, fuming, shouted at Theo, accusing him of mocking the council with his sophistry. But before he could continue, Osa Ragnar interjected. She calmly stated that she had listened to Theo's arguments, and while they were correct in theory, she reminded him that Ragnar's strength alone was not enough to make it great. Surprised, Wolfgang turned to her, but Osa continued, explaining that if Ragnar ignored the voices of their vassals and knights, they would inevitably fall. One cannot rule the world through tyranny alone, she added. Theo respectfully acknowledged her words, saying he would keep them in mind. Theo knew Osa Ragnar was the clan head's first wife, the Sword Dragon, and the most formidable swordsman in the north. She was known to be wise and powerful, and he was relieved that she didn't seem hostile toward him, though he couldn't quite understand why, given her knowledge of the destruction of Rose Palace. Osa then warned him that the punishment he would receive was justified. Theo, maintaining his calm, asked what that punishment would be. Wolfgang, still seething, declared that Theo would face 3 months of probation. Theo pointed out that the awakening ceremony was in 2 months, prompting Wolfgang to shout at him for daring to talk back. Osa, however, calmly explained that they had taken that into consideration and decided to allow him to participate in next year's ceremony instead. She also added that the 15 children injured by him would likewise participate next year. Ed, observing quietly, thought to himself that Julius's opposition to harsher punishment had lightened Theo's sentence. However, this outcome still worked in their favor. Delaying Theo's participation in the awakening ceremony was a significant dishonor within Ragnar, especially for the one representing Rose Palace. This dishonor would give Camellia Palace ample justification to overshadow Rose Palace. Once their plan was in motion, Ed believed Theo would be powerless to stop it. He even considered that if Theo foolishly attempted to appeal, they could simply eliminate him. But Ed didn't believe Theo would be that reckless. Suddenly, to the shock of everyone in the room, Theo announced that he wanted to appeal. The strongest dragons in the room were visibly stunned. Ed grinned widely, thinking that Theo's arrogance truly knew no bounds, making their plans even easier. Julius, worried, asked Theo if he understood what appealing truly meant. Theo confidently replied that he did. Theo knew his punishment, which was a mere 3-month probation, wasn't something that could be resolved so lightly. It was nothing more than a slap on the wrist, and he suspected that Julius had pulled some strings to secure such leniency. Still, Theo had no intention of accepting even that minor punishment. In the strong and proud Ragnar clan, appealing meant war. Theo declared that, in the end, only the victor could speak the truth, and he intended to be rewarded, not punished. As Theo spoke, the system notified him that he had entered the main scenario. The dragons were stunned by his audacity. The system informed him that this scenario would reveal many secrets hidden within the tightly sealed world of Ragnar, encouraging him to succeed. His scenario quest number 1 was labeled The Successor's Path. Meanwhile, at the hidden northern branch of the Seers Merchant Guild, chaos reigned. The guild building was being burned to the ground, and a figure in a cape swiftly swung a sword, cutting down one of the guild members with ease. As the destruction finished and the last of the guild members lay dead, the cloaked figure turned around. It was Evelyn. She heard Remington approaching, confirming that this was the place they had been searching for, just as their young Lord Theo had predicted. Remington, holding a small chest, showed it to her and declared that Camellia Palace, under the Troivian name, was finished. Back at the courtroom, Ed, unaware of what had just transpired, smiled confidently, thinking that their plans were proceeding smoothly and without interruption. Once the head dragons calmed down, Wolfgang addressed Theo, incredulous. He questioned whether Theo truly intended to escalate an issue that could be resolved with just 3 months of probation into a full-blown war, accusing him of being beyond arrogant. Wolfgang then asked if Theo believed he alone could stand against the combined forces of the 15 clans. Theo calmly responded that it was something he would handle himself. He added that in cases where there is a vast power imbalance, isn't it normal to resolve appeals through proxy battles? Julius knew that typically, an appeal meant deciding the outcome through war. However, when an outright war was nearly impossible due to a massive power disparity, a proxy battle, where each side sends a representative for a one-on-one duel, would be held. In this case, the representative of the defendant would naturally be Theo, while it was highly likely that Action would represent the plaintiff. Julius realized that if Action became Theo's opponent, it was almost guaranteed Theo would lose. He began to wonder if Theo had some hidden strategy or if he was under the mistaken belief that either Julius or Evelyn would step forward as his representative. If so, Julius thought Theo would be gravely disappointed. Theo then proposed that, following the established rules, they choose their representatives and hold the proxy battle in 1 week. He asked the council how they felt about his suggestion. Ed, deep in thought, figured this was Theo's tactic to rely on either Julius or Evelyn to fight for him, knowing their personalities would prevent them from doing so. This would leave Theo no choice but to fight himself. Ed decided that Action would be sent to crush Theo, and through this, Theo would learn his place. Ed was just about to voice his agreement with Theo's appeal and announce action as the representative when they were interrupted by a familiar voice. Every person in the room was stunned when they recognized it. The courtroom doors opened, and in walked the clan head, Theo Ragnar, who remarked that Theo had become quite adept at such sly schemes. Addressing Theo as his son, Kyle commented on how much Theo had changed since the last time they had met. Immediately, the head dragons bowed to their knees to greet their clan head, and Theo followed suit, bowing deeply as he introduced himself as apprentice swordsman Theo Ragnar. He respectfully greeted Kyle, referring to him as the incarnation of the great dragon god. At that moment, the system popped up in front of Theo, revealing that his first scenario quest was titled The Path of the Successor. To achieve this, he needed to take over Camellia Palace and uncover its secrets. Theo knew this was his first main quest since completing the tutorial, and wondered about the significance of the Camellia Palace secret. His thoughts turned to the blue light he had seen earlier. He had been too caught up in recent events to pursue it, but now he realized there was definitely something important there. However, Theo reminded himself that this wasn't the time to get distracted. He peeked up at his father, recognizing that an unpredictable and dangerous variable had just entered the situation. His carefully laid plans could be thrown off course with Kyle's unexpected arrival, and Theo couldn't help but wonder why his father had come. Kyle ordered Theo to stand, which he did immediately. The clan head then told him that he had heard about the situation by chance on his way to the tribunal and understood that Theo was in a complicated position. Kyle continued, saying that he also heard Theo wish to resolve the matter through an appeal via proxy battle, to which Theo confirmed that it was correct. Kyle looked at Theo and said that if he planned to go through with a proxy battle, it would be difficult for him to enter the fight himself. He then asked Theo who he intended to choose as his proxy, knowing this was a test. Ed, alarmed by the exchange, watched closely. Theo, however, confidently responded by asking what Kyle meant by someone standing in his place. He declared that there was no one else, and he had always intended to fight for himself in the appeal. Kyle, intrigued, told Theo he would lose, but Theo calmly replied, "How can you know unless I try?" He then confidently told his father that even if forced to bend, he would never lower himself willingly. Kyle smiled and burst into laughter, turning to the others in the room. He repeated Theo's words aloud, even if forced to bend, he will not lower himself willingly. Kyle proudly proclaimed that no better description of a Ragnar existed than that. Kyle shouted with satisfaction, clearly pleased with Theo's attitude, and thanked him for his boldness. Theo smiled, knowing the proxy battle was just bait. He wasn't actually planning to fight. The proof of Camellia Palace's treasonous conspiracy, which he had tasked Evelyn and Remington to uncover, would secure his victory without a single sword being drawn. It felt good to speak the truth freely. Then, unexpectedly, Kyle told Theo that he wished to give him a personal opportunity. As the Master of Ragnar, Kyle announced that he wanted to test a single strike against Theo. The statement left everyone, including Theo, stunned. Kyle explained that if Theo could endure just one strike from him, he would absolve Theo of all charges. Theo was left confused by the sudden shift. Kyle turned away and ordered Theo to follow him outside for the test. Before Theo could respond, Ed shouted, trying to intervene. Ed knew that for Kyle to offer a test of strength meant he acknowledged Theo as a worthy opponent. If Theo managed to survive the strike, it would signal the clan head's approval. Ed didn't believe Theo could endure Kyle's strike, but the mere possibility of Theo succeeding filled him with dread. Ed needed to stop Theo from gaining favor in the clan head's eyes. Ed argued that allowing vassals and bannermen to comment on the bloodline of Kyle's son was unacceptable. He suggested sticking to the rules and proceeding with the proxy battle instead. But Kyle, in a stern voice, addressed Ed as Sky Dragon and ordered him to shut up. Kyle declared that if a vassal dared to speak in such a way, they could simply get rid of them. Ed, silenced, reluctantly replied that he understood. Kyle then noticed Julius giggling quietly and asked if there was something he wished to say, since he had been laughing for quite some time. Julius, grinning, said it was nothing and explained that it had just been a while since Kyle had shown such interest in something. Kyle waved it off, saying Julius spoke nonsense, and cut the small talk short, turning his attention back to Theo. Kyle asked Theo directly, "How about my suggestion? Will you accept it?" Theo realized that the situation had taken a completely unexpected turn, and his original plan had crumbled. Still, he welcomed such changes. Smiling, Theo told Kyle that the test seemed far too heavy for him, and he asked how a single strike from the clan head could compare to a proxy war against vassals and bannermen. Kyle raised an eyebrow and asked if Theo was saying he wouldn't accept the challenge. Theo quickly clarified that he wasn't refusing but merely pointing out how much stricter the trial had become. Kyle, impressed, asked what Theo meant by that. Theo, looking up at the head dragons and then fixing his gaze on Ed, replied that the stakes should be adjusted accordingly. Specifically, he suggested compensation for such a harsh test. Kyle, intrigued, asked what compensation Theo had in mind. Theo boldly responded, something like Camellia Palace. His words left the room in stunned silence, and Ed's face contorted with shock and anger. Ed, quietly muttering under his breath, called Theo a brat. Meanwhile, Wolfgang thought the situation was sheer madness. He couldn't believe Theo had the audacity to propose a deal with the clan head. To Wolfgang, the half-blood Theo clearly didn't know his place. He believed Theo's arrogance would be his undoing, as making a deal implied that both parties were equals. But to Wolfgang's shock, Kyle agreed with Theo. Kyle turned to Theo, stating that if he truly aimed to become the successor, he needed to show at least that much boldness. He then asked Ed if he had any objections. Ed, knowing he couldn't openly defy the clan head, responded with feigned humility, saying that everything in Ragnar belonged to Kyle and he wouldn't dare comment on his decisions. Satisfied, Kyle ordered preparations to be made immediately, telling the council to ready the stage for Theo's trial. As Kyle turned to leave the room, he remarked that he would test Theo there and now. Theo remained quiet but smiled, knowing his plan was taking shape. Later, on the stage, Kyle and the dragon head stood on one side while Theo stood on the other. Ed fumed internally, frustrated that the trap he had laid to catch Theo had somehow transformed into a stage that could elevate him. Despite his growing anxiety, Ed reassured himself that Theo couldn't possibly withstand a single strike from the clan head, a feat even high-ranked swordsmen struggled with. With a malicious grin, Ed imagined Theo's death on that very stage. On the other hand, Theo was fully aware of Ed's thoughts, knowing Ed expected him to die there. But Theo smiled, confident that this wouldn't happen, thanks to a tutorial reward he had received. Kyle, noticing something unusual, asked Theo if he had consumed an elixir while no one was watching. He observed that even if Theo had taken one, such rapid growth should be impossible. But Kyle shrugged it off, saying it didn't matter how Theo had become stronger. Sharp as ever, Kyle had detected the change in Theo, even when the other dragons hadn't. Kyle acknowledged that, at the end of the day, Theo was still his flesh and blood. Kyle then asked Theo if he was warmed up, to which Theo replied that he was. Kyle explained that normally, he would use his greatsword. But since Theo didn't yet know how to use mana, he would settle for a rusty steel sword. He asked the other dragon heads if they had any objections, to which they all replied in agreement, of course not. As Kyle began releasing his aura, Theo was overwhelmed by the intense pressure radiating from his father. The sheer force of Kyle's fighting spirit made the air feel heavy, and Theo could hardly stand, his body trembling under the weight of it. Kyle noticed and commented that he was surprised Theo was still standing. Despite the crushing pressure, Theo smiled proudly. He knew he was only able to withstand the force because his strength stat had nearly tripled, thanks to the experience elixir he had received as a reward for clearing the tutorial. The elixir had granted him 5 additional levels, and he had allocated all the points into strength. As a result, his level had increased by 7, and his strength had shot up to 52. Theo felt an exhilarating sense of freedom, as if he had left the realm of the ordinary and stepped into the extraordinary. With his newfound strength, he believed he could block a single strike from his father. Kyle raised his sword, and everyone held their breath in suspense. When Kyle released the sword in Theo's direction, Theo quickly positioned himself, bracing for the impact. The sword connected, causing the floor beneath him to explode and shatter into pieces from the immense power. Thick smoke filled the air from the destroyed ground, but as it cleared, Kyle was stunned to see that Theo had managed to block his strike. Kyle, impressed, released Theo and began walking away. Before leaving, Kyle remarked that it had been a long time since he had found a decent son. At that moment, Theo's sword cracked and shattered into pieces, just as he collapsed from exhaustion and lost consciousness. Ed and Wolfgang were in disbelief that Theo had withstood the blow, while Julius and Osa looked relieved. Kyle then announced that Theo Ragnar had proven his innocence through sheer will, and the trial was concluded. The system appeared in front of Theo, congratulating him for successfully completing the sudden quest, Single Strike of Kyle Ragnar. As a reward, he had obtained inventory authority and a blue key. The next day, sunlight streamed through the window, hitting Theo's face, waking him. As he stirred, he asked aloud where he was. Before he could process his surroundings, his mother, Cecilia, rushed in, shouting with relief that he was finally awake. She tearfully asked if he had any idea how terrified she was when she heard he had been struck by the clan head's sword. She frantically asked about his arms and if he was injured, urging him to move his shoulder to check for any fractures or dislocations. Theo sat up, reassuring his mother that he was fine and telling her to calm down. Looking around, Theo asked his mother where they were. Just then, Julius entered the room, informing him that by order of the clan head, the former lady of Camellia Palace, Emil, along with Action and the director of intelligence, Ed, had been removed. Shocked, Theo asked if that meant he had passed. Julius, with a proud smile, confirmed it, telling Theo that he was currently in the Camellia Palace. The system popped up again, showing that the scenario had been updated and that Theo had achieved the Camellia Palace mission. His last mission was to uncover Camellia Palace's secret. Meanwhile, outside Camellia Palace, Amel furiously stomped her feet, shouting in disbelief at being forced to vacate what she believed to be her rightful property. Enraged, she repeatedly stomped her feet into the ground, ignoring her servants' desperate pleas for her to calm down and compose herself. Inside, Ed seethed with anger as he called Action. He ordered Action to kill Theo Ragnar. Action, nonchalantly, responded that he planned to take Theo's arm during the upcoming awakening ceremony. However, Ed, filled with fury, told Action to take Theo's head instead. Action, noticing the wrathful expression on his uncle's face, realized the gravity of the situation. Back inside Camellia Palace, Theo was deep in thought. Events had taken a completely different direction than he had anticipated, but the outcome was far better than he could have hoped for. He had gained control of Camellia Palace without even using his trump card. On top of that, he had acquired a second authority, the inventory. Curious, he opened his inventory, reached inside, and pulled out an apple. He took a bite while walking around, marveling at the concept of being able to store and retrieve objects seemingly out of thin air. Though he didn't fully understand how it worked, he knew it would prove incredibly useful. Theo reached into the inventory again and pulled out the blue key. It was categorized as a miscellaneous item, and its effect was listed as dungeon opening with matching dungeon gate requirement. He looked over at the room that had been emitting a blue light earlier and realized that the blue key was connected to that mysterious room. Theo inserted the blue key into the lock, and as he had expected, it fit perfectly. When the door opened, however, he was shocked to find not just another room but a cave hidden behind it. The system popped up, informing him that he had discovered a dungeon for the first time and that all experience earned inside would be doubled as a reward. Theo couldn't believe there was a cave concealed within Camellia Palace and figured this had to be tied to some sort of quest. Determined not to miss out on the doubled experience, he stepped forward, but paused, realizing he shouldn't enter empty-handed. A moment later, after loading up his inventory with a swarm of swords, Theo proceeded into the dungeon armed with a sword and shield. As he ventured deeper into the cave, he heard movement around him. His eyes widened in surprise as he came face to face with a massive white wolf, easily large enough to be a demonic beast. The wolf wasted no time and lunged at him. Fortunately, Theo reacted quickly, blocking its jaws with his shield just in time. Pretty strong, he muttered to the beast before swinging his sword at its side. He shouted, determined to show the wolf they wouldn't lose in a contest of strength. However, the wolf was quick, it released his shield and leaped back, narrowly avoiding his attack. The wolf bared its fangs and launched at him again, and Theo charged forward to meet it. He slashed at the beast, but it seemed unfazed, continuing its assault. Theo blocked with his shield, realizing just how tough the creature's hide was. It was fast too, his regular attacks weren't going to be enough to hurt it. This is no ordinary wolf, Theo thought, recalling tales of demonic beasts from the Demon Sea beyond the northern wall. This creature could easily be as powerful as one of those. As the wolf swiped its sharp claws at him, Theo ducked just in time to avoid the strike and dashed forward, thinking back to the ray of light he had seen when facing his father's single strike. Kyle's attack had been a perfect, breathtaking arc of pure white energy. Theo raised his sword, trying to mimic his father's technique, and swung down at the wolf, but the beast easily dodged by tilting its head to the side. The wolf leaped backward as Theo cursed under his breath, replicating that strike wasn't going to be easy. He realized that a single strike referred to delivering a blow so powerful that it ensured certain death in one motion. The key, he thought, was pouring everything into one perfect sword stroke. Deciding to focus entirely on his sword skills and the secret arts of speed that Evelyn had taught him, Theo let go of his shield. He jumped high into the air, catching the wolf off guard. The beast looked around, confused, and before it could react, Theo came down from above, driving his sword straight into the wolf's head. The wolf howled in agony as Theo pulled his sword free, blood pouring from one of its eyes. Theo smiled, satisfied with his success. The wolf, now blinded in one eye, growled in rage. Confident that he could finish the fight, Theo dashed toward the injured beast, ready for the final strike. 2 months later, at training ground number 4, Aud noted the growing number of people gathering, and Sybil agreed, suggesting they might need to switch training grounds due to the increasing crowd. Ever since word spread that Kyle Ragnar had taught Theo the famed single strike, more and more people were eager to spar with him. As they were discussing, Henry Morris from Plum Blossom Palace interrupted, mocking them and asking when their incredible young master would finally show up. He pointed out that it had been 2 months and hinted that perhaps Theo had run away after the story about him winning the trial had spread too far. He even implied that Theo might have exaggerated his achievements, especially since there were no witnesses to his victory at the trial or his confrontation with the Scaled Dragon Society. Before Henry could continue, Sybil landed a punch square on his face, sending him flying back. One of Henry's companions started to shout, furious at Sybil's audacity, but quickly fell silent when he noticed the glares of the knights surrounding Sybil. Seething with anger, Sybil insulted Henry and his group, declaring that they were nothing compared to Theo. Aud, attempting to defuse the tension, made a lighthearted comment about Sybil's own appearance, but Sybil, still fuming, insisted that he didn't care about such things. He was fed up with these troublemakers and wasn't about to let them insult their young master. With that, Sybil called on his comrades to draw their swords, declaring that the fight was on. The Plum Blossom Palace Knights followed suit, readying their weapons. Before the clash could escalate, a figure with long blue hair suddenly appeared, freezing the swords of both sides. The group was taken aback, recognizing the individual as Frost's sword, Theo Ragnar, one of the four hounds of the north. Moments later, loud laughter echoed through the training ground. Another figure appeared, announcing his presence, Black Bear, Holkus Lank, another of the four hounds. The knights were shocked to see two members of the four hounds present. Holkus, however, seemed disappointed by the gathering, asking where Theo was, referring to him as Luster Tiger and making it clear that he had come to challenge Theo personally. Meanwhile, deep within Camellia Palace's dungeon, Theo sat exhausted, sweat dripping down his face as he held his half-broken sword. The system continued to notify him that he had leveled up several times. He had been hunting demonic beasts relentlessly, and the system showed that he had taken down 170 so far. There was only one beast left in the dungeon, 1 out of 171. As Theo rested against the body of a slain wolf, a loud growl echoed from nearby. His status window popped up, revealing his current stats: level 15, strength 91, vitality 20, intelligence 19, allocatable stats 0, dexterity 25, magic power 198, luck -6, unknown stats 2.